Imagine inheriting the greatest empire in the world, only to find your brothers are your greatest enemies. Constantine's sons faced this brutal reality. Their story isn't just about dividing land, it's about a bloody purges, ruthless ambition, and a descent into fratricidal war that irrevocably changed the Roman Empire forever. What drove these brothers to destroy everything their father built? In the year 337, the Roman world held its breath. Constantine the Great was dead, and with him vanished the one authority strong enough to keep an empire already too vast, too diverse, too heavily armed, bound together by a single will. His reign had been a long march from civil war to consolidation, from the old gods to the Christian cross, raised above imperial standards. He had founded a new capital on the Bosporus, a city meant to be an eternal anchor, Constantinople, the new Rome glittering with marble and ambition. But an empire is not held by stone, it is held by obedience, and obedience demands clarity. Rome, even when it tolerated multiple emperors on paper, was trained by centuries to look for the senior hand, the unquestioned master. The tetrarchy of Diocletian had tried to tame succession through shared rule, and it had collapsed into bloodshed. Constantine himself had risen from that wreckage and learned its lesson in the hardest way possible. Rivals do not remain rivals for long. They become enemies or corpses. And yet, in the last act of his life, Constantine made a decision that would undo the peace he had spent decades forging. He did not name a single successor. He left the imperial inheritance to his sons, Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans, each a Caesar in his youth, each trained to command, each raised in the shadow of a father whose power had been absolute. In later ages, poets and chroniclers would recognize the danger in such a bequest, the way a realm can fracture when an old king's death creates a vacuum and ambitious heirs rush to fill it. The moment the throne becomes plural, loyalty begins to divide, and the state begins to speak with more than one voice. The arrangement looked at first glance like prudent distribution, a way to keep the frontiers defended, administrations functioning, armies paid. But the imperial office was not a set of equal chairs around a table. It was a prize. The title Augustus carried a weight that demanded deference, and deference in the Roman imagination could not be shared indefinitely. Without a clear hierarchy, without a single senior emperor whom all others acknowledged as master, cooperation became a performance, a diplomatic mask worn over suspicion. That instability was not accidental. It was built into the very idea of a triumvirate ruling the Roman world as equals. Roman political culture had been shaped by centuries of singular authority, whether in the republic's emergency dictatorships or the empire's increasingly sacred monarchy. Shared rule could function only when one man stood above the rest, or when the participants feared an external threat more than they desired each other's share. In the spring of 337, fear did not point outward. It pointed inward, to palaces, to barracks, to the bloodline itself. Constantine's empire, newly Christian in its public image and imperial rhetoric, had become a stage set for a family tragedy. The curtain rose not on unity, but on the sound of locked gates, whispered names, and the dull certainty that inheritance without order meant war without mercy. And as the empire waited for the sons of Constantine to step forward, three young emperors prepared to discover that the greatest threat to Rome was not the barbarian beyond the frontier, but the brother across the map. Constantius II emerged as the most seasoned in the arts of caution and control. He had spent years in the East, where the empire's wealth and complexity were matched by its dangers. The long frontier with the Persian Sasanian Empire, a rival monarchy that could muster disciplined armies and grand strategy. Constantius learned to think in terms of sieges, supply lines, court intrigue, and theological disputes that could ignite riots as surely as any tax. He was pious by temperament and political necessity, a ruler for whom religion and authority intertwined until they could not be separated. In him there was patience, but also a coldness, a habit of seeing threats everywhere and removing them before they could mature. Constantine II, the eldest, had the sharp edge of entitlement. In a dynasty where birth order mattered, he believed seniority ought to bring primacy. He commanded in the West in territories where Rome's old aristocratic pride still lingered in senates and villas, and where the Rhine frontier demanded decisive military presence. He had the bearing of a man who expected to be obeyed because he was first, because he was Constantine's firstborn male heir, because he carried his father's name most directly. Constans, the youngest, was still finding his shape when the empire placed a crown upon his head. His youth was a vulnerability others would test, but it was also a weapon he could be underestimated. He inherited Italy, Africa, and Illyricum, lands that included Rome itself, the symbolic heart of the Old World and the grain supply of Africa, the empire's lifeblood. He did not begin as the most feared of the three. That would change. The division of the empire after Constantine's death, formalized among the brothers, was meant to be equitable. It was anything but. Borders on parchment do not match the reality of roads, fortresses, tax streams, and the loyalties of legions. Provinces that looked tidy in an imperial office became contested when armies marched and courtiers whispered. Certain regions, strategic corridors, wealthy cities, military recruitment grounds were the equivalent of contested borderlands in later tales of great houses, places where rival claimants could not tolerate a neighbor's presence. Every allocation created resentment, not only because one brother possessed something the other desired, but because each brother believed he deserved more by right. The arrangement also carried a hidden insult. It treated the sons as colleagues. Constantine II, as eldest, did not want colleagues, he wanted precedence. Constantius II, ruling in the East with its immense resources and constant war, did not want interference, he wanted autonomy. Constans, placed in the center of the empire's symbolic geography, did not want guardians, he wanted respect. So the early years of the brothers' reign became a quiet contest of posture and provocation. Titles were weighed like weapons. Messages were phrased to assert seniority or independence. Officials were appointed not only for talent, but for loyalty to one brother over another. Coins, laws, and public ceremonies became declarations of legitimacy. Behind the formal language of imperial unity, each court watched the others, searching for weakness. In the corridors of power, the most dangerous wars begin before the first sword is drawn. A governor's promotion, a bishop's condemnation, a general's transfer. Each could be a signal, each could be interpreted as encroachment. The empire had been divided, but the idea of empire was indivisible, and each brother inherited not merely land, but the temptation to become, like their father, the only emperor. As the Triumvirate tried to perform harmony, it grew more fragile with every gesture, and the stage was set for the act of violence that would poison the dynasty from within. The bloodletting began with a shock that echoed from the palaces into the provinces and would haunt later generations of Roman rulers. In the months after Constantine's death, members of the wider Constantinian family were systematically eliminated. Princes and cousins who might have served as rivals, men with imperial blood and plausible claims, were killed. Among the most notable victims were Julius Constantius, Constantine's half-brother, and his sons. Also slain were Dalmatius, who had been elevated under Constantine, and Hannibalianus, a figure marked for special honor in the East. The surviving sources do not offer a single clear command signed in an emperor's hand. They speak instead of soldiers, of a purge carried out by the army, of the violent logic of succession unleashed when no single authority stood unquestioned. Whether this was orchestrated by one brother agreed upon by all, or driven by the army's own brutal instincts remains debated among historians. What is not debated is the effect. The family tree was cut down to a stump, leaving the three brothers as the primary adult heirs, and in the long run, leaving only a few male relatives alive, most notably the young Julian and his half-brother Gallus, spared for reasons that may have included youth, political calculation, or mere circumstance. It was a massacre that resembled the most chilling moments in later stories of dynastic power, the cold, methodical removal of potential claimants, not in battle but in their homes, not as a last resort, but as a first act of security. In the Roman imperial system, legitimacy was strengthened by bloodline, but bloodline also multiplied danger. In a shared rule without firm hierarchy, each brother could look upon a cousin not as a family member but as a future usurper supported by the wrong army at the wrong time. The motivations were embedded in the triumvirate's insecurity. If the empire were truly one, a cousin's claim could be treated as treason against the whole. But with the empire divided, a rival could be seen as a threat to one brother's portion, specifically a dagger pointed at a particular court. Every surviving male relative became a potential flag around which dissatisfied generals might rally. The purge was the empire's immunological response, violent, overreactive, and permanently damaging. And once the blood was spilled, trust between the brothers could not recover. Even if they did not all sign the orders, they all benefited. Each knew that the others had reason to approve, reason to remain silent, reason to pretend innocence while accepting the results. It turned shared rule into shared guilt. From that point onward, the triumvirate was no longer merely unstable. It was morally contaminated. The brothers stood atop a foundation of kinslaying, and the message to every official, every general, every bishop was unmistakable. The dynasty would preserve itself through violence, and violence would be rewarded with survival. Such a beginning did not merely forecast conflict. It ensured that when conflict came, it would be fought without restraint, because the first act of their reign had already crossed the boundary that civilized politics pretends exists. The purges cleared the chessboard, but they also narrowed the family to 3 players who could not retreat from the logic they had unleashed. With rivals eliminated, the brothers had removed one kind of threat, only to sharpen the most dangerous rivalry of all the rivalry between themselves. And that rivalry, fed by grievances over territory and rank, was about to move from cold diplomacy to marching armies. The first fracture widened between the eldest and the youngest, between Constantine II and Constans. Constantine II believed that seniority entitled him to a form of guardianship over his younger brother, perhaps even a share of his territories. Some sources suggest that in the early arrangement, Constantine II held a supervisory role over Constans while the younger brother was still a minor, and that disputes arose as Constans asserted himself and refused to remain under tutelage. Whether or not formal guardianship existed in a strict sense, the political reality was clear. Constantine II acted as though he should command, and Constans increasingly acted as though he would not be commanded. The quarrel hardened into a territorial dispute, centered on provinces that were more than mere land. They were revenue, manpower, strategic routes. In the Roman Empire, to lose a province was not to lose a border on a map. It was to lose the capacity to pay soldiers, to feed cities, to reward loyalists. A province could decide whether an emperor was feared or vulnerable. By 340, diplomacy had failed. Constantine II marched into Italy, crossing into what Constans considered his domain. It was a decision heavy with the arrogance of an elder brother who assumed the younger would yield, or that the mere presence of the senior Augustus would cause officials and troops to defect. But Italy was not a passive prize. It was a corridor lined with fortresses and loyalties, and Constans did not flee. He met invasion with speed and calculation. Near Aquileia, at the northeastern edge of Italy, the confrontation culminated. The details of the battle are sparse, filtered through later summaries, but its outcome was decisive. Constantine II was killed, ambushed, or trapped in the fighting. The eldest son of Constantine the Great, the man who believed he should naturally be first, died not on a distant frontier defending Rome from foreigners, but in a civil war against his own brother. In that moment, the triumvirate ceased to exist. One leg of the structure had been hacked away, and what remained did not stabilize, it lurched. Constans absorbed the territories of the fallen Constantine II, expanding his power across much of the West. The victory made him stronger, but it also created a new imbalance. 2 emperors now faced each other across a vast empire, each with reasons to fear the other's ambition. Constantius II in the east could not ignore the fact that his western counterpart had proven willing and able to destroy a brother. It is tempting to imagine that the death of Constantine II might have brought clarity, even peace, by simplifying the succession. But Rome did not reward simplicity with stability. The empire was now divided between 2 men with different priorities and rival courts, while external pressures continued without pause. Constantius II remained locked in tension with Persia, where Shapur II pressed hard against Roman Mesopotamia. Constans, ruling the West, faced the familiar strains of frontier defense, taxation, and the politics of an elite that still remembered earlier civil wars. And beneath all of it lay the deeper consequence of fratricide, the normalization of violent transfer. If an emperor could kill a brother, than a general might imagine killing an emperor. The army had watched the dynasty's internal bloodshed and learned a lesson older than Rome itself: power belongs to the one who can seize it and hold it. That lesson soon took flesh in the figure of Magnentius, a powerful officer who in 350 was proclaimed emperor by his supporters in Gaul. Constans was caught off guard, his authority crumbling with startling speed. Betrayed, hunted, he fled, only to be killed near the Pyrenees. The youngest son of Constantine, who had defeated his brother and ruled the West, died as a fugitive in his own realm, brought down not by family this time, but by the army's appetite for a new master. With Constans dead and Magnentius holding the West, Constantius II faced the grim inheritance of a dynasty that could no longer govern through shared blood. He now had to reunite the empire by force, and to do it while guarding the eastern frontier. The empire's internal war, born from the Triumvirate's contradictions, had opened the door to usurpation, and Rome was about to pay the price in battles fought not against foreigners but against the Constantius II moved westward into a storm of civil war. The struggle against Magnentius was not a brief rebellion. It was a drawn-out contest that bled the empire's military strength. In 351, the armies collided at Morsa Major, a battle so costly that ancient writers remembered it with dread. Roman killed Roman in heaps, the kind of slaughter that no frontier victory could easily replace. The empire might win territory back, but it could not easily win back veterans, morale, or the unspoken belief that Rome's legions existed to defend the world rather than tear it apart. Magnentius retreated, but he did not vanish. The war dragged on until 353, when Constantius' forces triumphed at Mons Seleucus. Magnentius, facing defeat, took his own life. The usurpation was crushed, and Constantius II stood as sole emperor, at last the singular authority that Roman political culture demanded. Yet the victory carried a bitter irony. Constantius had achieved what his father once held, unity under one emperor. But the cost was staggering. The western provinces had been destabilized, their loyalties shaken, the military had been exhausted, and the precedent of rebellion had been reaffirmed. The imperial court, increasingly wary, turned inward, seeing conspiracies in every shadow. In such an atmosphere, the machinery of purges and executions first deployed in the dynasty's opening act found new justifications. Constantius II also inherited a more subtle wound: the fragmentation of trust between center and periphery. Civil war had proven that the West could raise an emperor against the East, and that the East could march armies across the empire to reclaim the West. This was unity, yes, but unity achieved through violence, not consent. It was a unity that depended on constant vigilance and the threat of force. And still, the dynastic problem remained unresolved. Constantius had no surviving brothers. The male line of Constantine had been narrowed by the massacre of 337 and the wars that followed. The dynasty's survival now depended on the few remaining male relatives who had been spared in childhood, men like Gallus and Julian, whose lives had been shaped by the terror that had killed their kin. Constantius elevated Gallus to Caesar, then later had him executed amid accusations of misrule and suspicion. Julian, the last male of the Constantinian line, was eventually raised as Caesar and sent to Gaul, where his unexpected military successes earned him loyalty and made him dangerous in the eyes of a suspicious Augustus. When Julian was proclaimed Augustus by his troops in 360, the empire teetered on the edge of yet another civil war. Constantius marched to confront him, but fate intervened. Constantius II died in 361, naming Julian as successor on his deathbed according to later accounts. The empire avoided one battle, but it could not avoid the truth that had stalked the dynasty from the beginning. The Constantinian house had been unable to design a stable transfer of power, and the army had become the decisive elector of emperors. Julian's reign would be brief and dramatic, marked by his rejection of his uncle's Christian program and his attempt to restore traditional cults, earning him the epithet the apostate in later Christian memory. He died in 363 on campaign against Persia. With him ended the male line of Constantine. The dynasty that had once claimed the world through a single towering figure dissolved into the broader, harsher pattern of late Roman politics. Emperors made by soldiers, legitimacy contested by force, unity fragile and often temporary. The brothers' wars and the usurpations they enabled did not merely reshuffle rulers. They reshaped the empire's political psychology. They proved that division at the top invited violence below, and that once the imperial family demonstrated the logic of murder and seizure, others would follow. In later centuries, when the Roman world fractured more sharply between East and West, when rival courts and rival generals competed for shrinking resources, the memory of this era would remain a warning written in blood. The empire could survive foreign enemies, but it might not survive itself. The ultimate outcome of Constantine's succession was not a stable dynasty, but a precedent. After the Constantinian line faltered, new emperors rose without Constantine's blood, and the cycle of usurpers and counter-usurpers continued. The empire's structure could endure, especially in the east, where Constantinople would outlast the Western Empire by nearly a millennium. But the western provinces, strained by civil wars, manpower loss, economic disruption, and the constant need to appease or confront powerful military leaders, moved further along the path toward political fragmentation. The decline of the Western Roman Empire had many causes and cannot be reduced to a single family's tragedy, yet the Constantinian succession crises formed part of the cumulative damage, battles that emptied ranks, rival claims that weakened legitimacy, and an imperial culture trained to expect violence at every transition. In the end, Constantine's vision stands in sharp contrast to his son's reality. He had imagined a unified Christian empire sanctified by a single divine favor. Ruled from a new capital that would bind East and West, his monuments and laws spoke of order, permanence, and providence. But the empire he left behind was governed by men, shaped by the very system that made Constantine great, the system in which power was seized, defended, and inherited through force. By dividing authority among his sons without creating an unbreakable hierarchy, he placed a crown upon three heads and demanded they wear it as one. The result was not shared stewardship, but mutual fear. It began with family blood spilled in palace corridors, continued with brother fighting brother at Aquileia, and widened into civil wars that invited ambitious generals to gamble for the purple. The Constantinian dynasty, born from Constantine's victory over rivals and his transformation of the empire's religious identity, became a cautionary tale about succession itself. Grand visions can be undone not only by enemies outside the walls, but by the flawed structures within, structures that turn brothers into claimants, claimants into enemies, and an empire's inheritance into a battlefield. And as the lights of Constantine's new city burned along the Bosporus, steady, magnificent, seemingly eternal, the dynasty that gave it its name slipped into history, leaving behind a paradox worthy of Rome, a family that reshaped the world, and then, through its own division, revealed just how fragile that reshaping had always been.